Hi, folks. Welcome. It is just about 11:54 or so. As we have folks joining us, just know that we are going to get started promptly at noon. So just stand by and just don't mind seeing our faces as we get ready for today's webinar. So there you go. Everyone should be getting that acceptance before they join to make sure that you are okay with it being recorded. Again, my name is Lorena Mosquera. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes. I'm going to give a couple of little housekeeping notes again, is that it is a webinar. It is not a meeting. That means that you're only going to see the participants that we have up on the virtual stage. If you have any questions throughout today's event, please make sure you put those on the chat and or the Q&A. If it is a topic specific question, I do appreciate it if you put it in the Q&A. It allows us to track all the questions that we have and those that we have answered. But if you cannot access the Q&A or you'd rather just do it in the chat, I will be monitoring both throughout today's webinar. So we will make sure that we get back to you. If for some reason we do not get to your question while we are in the webinar, we will make sure we follow up, and one of the members of the DLA team will make sure to touch base with you. Again, thank you for today's webinar. We are going to get started in just about a minute. My name again is Lorena Mosquera, and I am with Paradigm Marketing and Design, and we are here to welcome you to DLA's webinar, breaking down the new Global Internal Audit Standards, what it may mean for your next quality assessment and review. We are going to get started in just about a minute. Again, we are going to have only the panelists visible on the stage, and this event is being recorded. We do hope to have this event available for download sometime next week, so we will make sure we put those follow-up instructions for you in the chats. The chat box, again, is open to all, but we would prefer if you have topic-specific questions, you put them in the Q&A, and if you just have any other commentary, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, but don't be alarmed. I will be monitoring both, so I will make sure that the staff gets back to you with any questions. And without further delay, it is exactly 12 o'clock. I'm going to hand the controls over to Paul Higgins, and Paul Higgins is partner and head of insurance practice and the Chicago office leader within Internal Audit and Accounting Advisory. So I'm going to pass the controls over to you and stay in the background.
Great. Well, thanks, Lorena, and good morning or good afternoon. I know we have folks across different time zones, so I appreciate you taking the time out from your busy schedule, especially on a Friday, as hopefully you're trying to wrap up for the weekend. But let's maybe just what we'll do is we'll do some quick introductions on our end, and then I'll walk you through the agenda. So by way of introduction, my name is Paul Higgins. I'm a partner based in Chicago. I lead up DLA's local internal audit support, and together with Arlene and Errol, we help lead up our quality assessment review teams as well. I've spent about 25 plus years in the internal audit space, and during that time done over 20 quality assessment reviews. So as we go through the standards today, I'm looking forward to kind of highlighting for you and educating you around kind of the key changes, what implications that may have for your external quality review, and kind of next steps. So with that, I'll hand you over to Arlene from our team to do a brief introduction.
Hello, my name is Arlene Pottinger. I'm a managing director in DLA's IA and advisory group. I have over 25 years of experience in the internal and external audit field. And at DLA, my current focus is overseeing engagements in the asset management, REIT, and BDC internal audit space. And to accomplish that goal, I work closely with a number of internal audit departments with my clients. You know, some of those internal audit departments have been subject to QAR reviews. So for today, I am looking forward to sharing with you some key changes in the Global Internal Audit Standards and sharing some insights on conducting quality assessment reviews. So looking forward to the next hour with all of you. With that, I'll hand it over to Errol.
Great, thanks very much, Arlene. My name is Errol Lebowski. I'm a managing director in the internal audit and advisory practice at DLA and predominantly serve our REIT clients. I have over 25 years of experience, which includes nearly 10 years as the head of internal audit for a publicly traded REIT. So for the chief audit executives in the audience, I've been in your seat and understand the responsibilities of overseeing an internal audit department, including managing the quality assessment review process. And my colleagues and I look forward to walking you through this topic and answering your questions.
Thanks, Errol. So just quickly going through the agenda, as we articulated, we're going to walk through the new standards. I will walk through from high level how it's structurally changed. And then the real key changes as we've gone through, it's close to 150 pages of the new internal audit standards framework, really kind of help highlight the key changes. So we'll kind of work our way through that. I would say if we to go through each standard and all the changes, we need at least a half day, but wanted to kind of educate you a little bit on the high level changes. Want to talk through a little bit as well, the adoption timeline and the implications for your next quality review. Certainly there's some strategy around thinking through if you've got a quality assessment review from an external perspective due this year or next year, how to think through the changes in the standards and how to address that. And then what we wanted to do is share a little bit of our insights from doing them reviews, what we've seen has worked well, how to really get the most out of them reviews, and get the insights beyond the standard compliance. And so kind of wrapping up, what we'll do is we'll have kind of a quick summary of what we think the call to action is. And, I always think about from an internal audit lens, where there's any change in a process, so in this case, the change in the standards, there's going to be changes that will impact people, process, and technology. So as we talk through a little bit of the changes and where action's needed, we'll kind of highlight them in them buckets. And then at the back end, we have some time allotted for Q&A. I'd certainly encourage you as we go through the discussion today, if you've got any questions, Lorena and the team will be monitoring the chat for any questions. And we'll pause during the presentation to address them questions where best can. So maybe just moving to the next slide, just kind of structurally how the standards have been changed. They've kind of laid out the new standards around these 5 domains. And within the 5 domains, then we have what they call the 15 guiding principles and then the 52 standards. Really the guiding principles and the overall focus around the change in the standards was really to drive kind of the overall quality and effectiveness of the internal audit. I think, Lorena, actually, I think we might have had a quick polling question here just to maybe level set here a little bit on the changes in the standards.
Yep, I apologize.
Problem.
I was responding.
No problem.
I had a lot of questions and I needed to make sure I answered those.
No worries. A lot of interested people.
Yes.
So we actually have a couple of polling questions later. So we just want to get people, I'm sure you're all comfortable with the technology, but we just wanted to ask you kind of when were the internal audit standards last updated? So if you could take a few seconds here just to click, and we'll look at the polling results. So
I'm
Lorena,
going to give them another 5 seconds because there's actively a lot of people voting and taking part of this. So just give them.
Okay.
It's amazing. They're all still voting. Okay. Now everyone. Perfect. I'll close it out.
Okay. So we've got a lot of smart people here in the audience today. We got the 2017 was when it was last updated. I would say there was probably, from my lens, having worked with the standards before, enhancements and updates made. The changes that we go through today are structurally, from my lens, a lot bigger, and maybe some of that's due to the geography and spread. 2017 doesn't seem that long ago, but 2016 was option B, and that's when the Cubs last won the World Series. So that seems a lifetime ago. So 2017, it's been some time. And really the goal is with the changing risk landscape, businesses profile changing, and really the focus on enhancing the quality of internal audit. That's why they've introduced. So the standards were released in January of this year, January 9th. So this is all very fresh, hot off the press. And it's been laid out in this manner. So I was talking a little bit just kind of on the directionally on the standards. The standards outlined within the 52 standards outline the requirements. So they're must-dos. You'll see the words. There's actually 5 pages of definitions within the overall 150 pages, and they talk about within the requirements, they use the language should. So that means they're required to be implemented. I think what's great to see in the new standards, they talk about considerations, giving people ideas about how they could implement the requirements. And then at the last piece, which will be important later, is how giving you examples of evidence of conformance. So how can you demonstrate that you've addressed the standards? And that's important. That list that they provide in the standards, that's not really meant to be exhaustive. It's just really meant to be a guide. And as you kind of think through the standards and how you will evidence, whether through documentation, processes, training, etc., that you've met the overall requirements of the standards. So just looking a little bit on the right, just visually how they've kind of laid out the overall domains. I actually kind of haven't done the quality reviews before and kind of worked my way through the standards. I actually like the way they've organized it, and it's really kind of organized, if you think about from 3 through 5, around the roles within internal audit. So the governing role, that being the chief audit executive, managing then the internal audit function, which is typically obviously a combination of the chief audit executives and his or her direct reports. And then there's the performing of the internal audit engagement, which is really the day-to-day audit execution. So maybe just kind of before we jump on to the next slide, I think just the one domain, the purpose of internal audit, actually doesn't have any principles or standards tied to it. And the way I think about how we would think about the purpose of internal audit, think about that as almost your elevator pitch. How, as a CAE or within internal audit, how do you articulate what internal audit's overall purpose is, and what its overall goals and adding value to the organization, how you articulate that to your key stakeholders, and likewise then your stakeholders should understand what you do and how you add value within the organization. Within that, there's some elements that lined out around what are the essential elements that need to be in place in order for internal audit to meet that overall kind of value purpose back to the organization. So think about it that way. It's actually very helpful. And I think what I encourage people to do is work through the remaining of the standards and then revisit the main one. So with that, maybe we'll jump to the next slide. We just want to, over the next few slides, just want to lay it out structurally how the standards are laid out. So domain 2 is really, for folks familiar with the previous internal audit standards, is really the old code of ethics, code of conduct. It's been laid out in this manner. And I think what we did is we actually highlighted, you see across each of the 5 pillars there as it relates to the overall guiding principles, internal auditors. I think this is a good juncture just to remind folks that the internal audit or the Institute of Internal Audit Standards apply to both individuals in their job responsibilities and to the overall internal audit function. So as internal auditors in your day-to-day responsibility, you have a responsibility to comply with the overall IAA standards. Obviously, the CAE in their role has the responsibility for the overall function in conforming with the standards. But again, the importance here that the individual internal auditors are aware of this. And certainly the CAE must, kind of equip the individual auditors in their ability to address the overall standards. And that might include training, processes, procedures, and overall education. So, again, as I said, rather than going through each of these principles, what we wanted to do is kind of give you the cliff notes as we've gone through, assessed, and analyzed the key changes. So as I kind of look at that second one, to maintain objectivity, I think what they've really, and the one thing that kind of stood out to me was around kind of the independence and objectivity, particularly as it relates to advisory projects. I think as more and more internal audit functions are viewed as a value add to the organization, they get pulled into advisory projects that fall outside their typical assurance project. And the focus here on is, how do you make sure that you've got the right safeguards in place that you can, if subsequently providing an assurance project within that area, that you've got the right level of independence and objectivity safeguards in place. I think the obvious one in the pillar 3 there around demonstrating competency is around continuous professional development. The standards now have outlined that they require that individual internal auditors get 20 hours of CPE a year. So that for some internal audit functions, that might require some additional effort and training, obviously complementary to what people need to get as it relates to their own maybe professional designation. So if they're CIA, CPA qualified in meeting the requirements for that, then how collectively they meet the overall 20-hour requirement. This next pillar 4, what's interesting is that, and if people have picked up on this, is, if I think about and 4.3, professional skepticism. I mean, that's from my perspective, having spent 25 plus years in the industry, that's largely implied in what you do as an auditor day to day. But, Earl, maybe this might be a good juncture. I know we were talking earlier in the week, like this kind of popped out to us as well. We're like, oh, how should internal audit functions kind of think about that? Maybe what are some of the things, elements to look for, and then kind of how to address that requirement. If you could share maybe a little bit your thoughts from earlier in the week, that would be great, Earl.
Sure. Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, it's important that auditors exercise professional skepticism when planning and performing internal audit services. Doing so will allow auditors to make objective judgments based on facts and information rather than just on trust and belief. And this includes not taking information received verbatim or at face value, and having a process and methodology in place to validate that information is relevant, reliable, and sufficient. Examples of conformance with the professional skepticism standard include evidence that work papers and engagement documents are reviewed and signed by a senior member of the engagement team, and properly documenting and reporting instances where false or misleading information is given to the engagement team. Chief audit executives can help their teams build their competency around professional skepticism by having their teams participate in workshops and other training opportunities to develop and learn to apply this concept.
Yeah, thanks, Earl. And I think, obviously that training piece is important. And then to the extent that, CAEs kind of determine a process maybe around, similar to the external audit side where you've got key report reliance and checks and balances that you implement. Maybe for some of the more high risk audits, you think about, do you apply them same level of kind of rigor and discipline in the review of key reports? Yeah, no, thanks, Earl. That's helpful on that. And just maybe something to think in mind is, again, because it's called out specifically as a standard in of itself. The last column, if you think about internal auditors day to day handle a lot of, sensitive and company information, and really the importance around how you handle that, and the importance that's placed on internal auditors as to how they handle, store, and maintain that information. What I will tell you as well, within the IA standards, they have talked about within the public sector specific requirements around the protection of information, et cetera. So that would require a much more in-depth discussion around that specific topic specifically for the public sector. So maybe just moving on to the domain tree. This is really focused on kind of, again, the governance of internal audit. And the one thing that strikes you here is you see the word board underlined across all three of the principles. And, as a chief audit executive or audit director, you sit there and go, well, how do I make sure, or how do I make sure this happens? And I think what the standards are really trying to encourage here is the partnership between, the internal audit function, the board, and senior management. And, kind of highlighting that the critical role that the board and senior management have in ensuring the success of the internal audit function. So you'll see within the standards here that they talk about essential elements. And again, these are kind of the key activities that the board and senior management must do and support to help the chief audit executive in their role. What I would say is, for most of you, you're probably, sitting here thinking, well, I do that already. I have quarterly meetings with the board. I have, periodic meetings with the senior management. I would say my observation doing quality reviews over the years is that the ones that do that better, have that more kind of formalized and have better outreaches to senior management and more outward looking as an internal audit function, tend to operate as a more highly operating internal audit function. Really, because then there's close alignment and coordination around, the overall mandate. What's the overall goal of internal audit within the organization? And having that level of interaction supports that level of coordination. And getting that buy-in support then really allows for internal audit to be effective in their overall mandate and purpose. So I would say, obviously 6 is largely around kind of formalizing that process, that level of interaction, and obviously demonstrating that when subject to a quality review. With the changes in the standards, obviously, if there was a change in the CAE, that would trigger them same kind of discussions that would be needed in that kind of, column 6 or pillar 6, as you should say. And so in that mindset, I would kind of view kind of 6 and 7 as kind of one-off kind of activities that are triggered by either changes in the standards or changes in the CAE role or other more structural changes within your organization. Where I think the real focus on this is going to be around is on the right-hand side around, kind of the ongoing interaction with the board and with management. Have you established kind of the cadence for interaction with the board beyond the quarterly meetings? How do you structure that? Have you determined the criteria for which you determine what gets elevated and escalated, whether that be from a risk tolerance or other issues to the board? How do you coordinate that with management? And then kind of around the focus around quality. And I think actually this might be a good juncture, Arlene, because I know obviously one of the topics, the headline topics we had here was in our event, our webinar was the quality assurance review program. Might be a good indication to help kind of maybe educate. There might be some folks on the call that haven't had a quality assurance review. What does it entail? What's the frequency of it, and kind of what are the outputs of it?
Thanks, Paul. I see we have the next polling question up, so if everybody can go ahead and answer that, and then we'll talk to it at the end. So, Paul, as you mentioned, the QAR is the quality review.
Do you want me to share the end results polls? Because we've got everyone that's participated in it. Do you want me to share them now?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, go ahead.
There you go.
Okay.
Well, just seeing the results here, not sure. I think that's obviously will be helpful as we talk through a little bit today around the timeline and frequency, so people can assess the next timeline for their QAR review. So sorry,
Right.
back to you, Arlene.
Right. So the QAR is an independent quality review assessment of an internal audit department. It's designed to evaluate the internal audit's activity conformance with the IAA standards. So basically, if an organization says that it's conducting its audits in accordance with the IAA standards, what we get the feel of is, and we get confidence in, is that it has met a certain level of rigor. And part of that rigor is that it must meet the 5-year review requirement. The IAA department must obtain an external assessment every 5 years, performed by an independent reviewer or an independent review team to maintain conformance with the standards. So then you may say, why do I need to do this? What's the benefit to the organization? Well, there is enhanced credibility of the IAA activity within the organization. It also helps to manage some internal costs, audit costs. There is improved focus on core competencies. We will gain access to methodologies and resources. There is also a strengthening of the communications, both internally and externally. And it enhances the objectivity and independence through that review. So again, the review must be performed by a qualified reviewer or review team. And that means that they have to be independent of the IAA organizations. Now, there are some areas that must be covered, and a few of those is the IAA aligned with corporate objectives? Are there methodologies, tools, and technologies? Communication and reporting is looked at. What do your stakeholders expect? The audit plan execution, and there's even a look at the human capital. So while we have these outlined, now you may be saying, well, what's the process? Well, the process would include interviews. Those individuals interviewed would be senior management, the board, the audit committee chair, the I staff. And some of what these interviews are designed to tease out is, opportunities that these individuals see for improvement, or if they have specific needs that they think the IAA department can meet. Another section that's conducted during the interviews is their surveys. And these surveys are responded to by senior management, again, the board, the audit committee, and the staff. And there are also some on-site procedures. So Paul, just at a high level, the critical components of the QAR is that it's done every 5 years. The reviewer has to be independent of the IAA department, and the review must be done as a comparison to the IAA standards.
Yeah, thanks, Arlene. And I think just going through the new changes in the standards, I say a couple of things to highlight here. For the most part, hasn't changed around the requirements, except for the fact that within the review team, you must have a certified internal auditor. So there must be at least one person who's a certified internal auditor. And then what's interesting as well is, and it kind of is consistent with the overall kind of message on this slide here, is that it's actually working with the board to actually kind of effectively get them input and kind of co-develop kind of the overall expectation for the EQA. So that level of involvement and the fact that the results, the overall results must be shared and present it back to the board is important. So maybe with that, just thanks for that, Arlene. Just jumping on to the next slide here. This is kind of...
Paul, I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you with a question because it seems pertaining to the topic that you just finished.
Sure.
And are IA standards applicable to all companies or the firms that have CIAs in an IA department?
So the IA standards will apply to all internal audit functions, especially if they articulate or indicate that they're doing their work in compliance and in line with the standards of the Institute of Internal Audit. What I will tell you as well, in addition, other stakeholders from outside the organization are aware of the overall requirements for internal audit to be subject to review and may look for that same, external review that's done. So generally, what we do is say encourage all internal audit functions that they should do a quality assessment review.
Great, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I can see, sorry, just at the bottom of the screen, a lot of questions and Q&A coming in. So we will stop here in a few minutes and make sure that we allocate adequate time, Lorena, on the questions. Just quickly going through this is kind of really the responsibility of the CAE to kind of manage what I've described as kind of the medium to long-term success of the internal audit function. So this is really kind of how do they plan strategically, make sure they get the right level of resources and the overall communication and quality in place. There's a lot to cover here. What I would say, what really struck me and the team going through the standards was, as it relates to 9.5, which for me is great to see because I've, having done a number of these reviews, it really is emphasizing the coordination that internal audit must do across the other risk assurance parties within the organization and external. So that means coordinating with maybe the ERM, other control functions within the organization, such as a SOX function that may be separate to internal audit, and then also with the external auditors, really to kind of see, to the extent that there can be reliance placed on the work that internal audit's doing. But I would also say, more importantly as well, to maybe highlight if there's gaps, where are there gaps in the overall control coverage within the organization, and really kind of getting everybody on the same page. So that level of coordination is great to see. And that might involve, internal audit working with, other risk management activities in the or control activities in the organization, sharing kind of their risk taxonomy, their risk assessment, and cross-pollinating, really sharing across the organization, which I think can only help elevate the overall control assurance in the organization. So I was really happy to see that level of coordination. On the managing resources, if you think about the conversations that most of you as a CAE have had over the years around, do you have adequate resources to do your plan? And it was always focused on people. Now the focus as well is around, do you have adequate technology as a function to be successful and deliver on your mandate? So on 10.3 there around technical resources, now the emphasis, and if you think about it, we're in the year 2024 and how important technology is to the day-to-day business operations. The question is does internal audit have, and is it equipped with enough and adequate technology to do their work and do it at the standard expected? I know we'll do a quick time check in a few minutes. I just want to kind of highlight a few on these slides, and we'll jump to the final domain, and then I know we'll have a quick recap. Communicating results. Again, you'd see on 11.1 there, again, the importance of kind of the communication with stakeholders. That should come out throughout today's webinar. If there's one takeaway as an internal audit function, you need to think about how are the lines of communication established with our key stakeholders and how open are they from a two-way perspective. But again, the emphasis here around effective communication and results and the importance around that. The one element I would talk about on the right-hand side on enhancing quality is the internal audit standards talks about going above and beyond conformance with the IA standards. And that's great to see as well. It's like, what performance metrics have you established that are aligned to your overall internal audit strategy? And then, key performance indicators and the expectation that you report them back to the board annually. That also goes to 12.1 as well, the internal quality assurance program. Having looked at that over the years at internal audit functions, they've emphasized the importance of looking at holistically across your function and reporting the results of that back to the board annually. Historically, what I found is I've looked at QA IP programs, and they're largely just focused on selecting a sample of work papers, without stepping back and saying, do we have a good methodology? Do we have all the other processes in place? How do we assess ourselves from the timeliness and quality of our reporting? And so introducing additional standards and requirements around that. But again, the QAIP is important to report out to the board annually. So we're jumping on to the next slide here. And this is the last of kind of the structural layout of the standards. And then we've got a quick recap slide. And maybe, Lorena, when we get to that slide, might be a good juncture if there's other questions or comments that have come in to address at that point. I would say domain 5, the way to think about domain 5, this is really kind of your roadmap for your audit execution, you know, your project management of your audits, your assurance audits. What I've been pleasantly happy or surprised to see, but it's good, is around the emphasis around this roadmap applies to both assurance and advisory engagements. And so that means that as you're doing advisory projects, you'll need to kind of go through these standards and say, okay, understanding kind of the narrow, you know, kind of subset or objectives of this advisory project. How do I make sure, though, at the same time, I have the same level of discipline around how I execute on that project and the same kind of level of standards? Now, obviously, some of these may not be applicable given the you know, the narrowness of the specific advisory project, but it's really encouraging the auditors to think about how they make sure they get the right level of project discipline. A couple other things that I just kind of want to highlight here. There's definitely a focus on the reporting, which is great to see. Again, if I kind of think about some of the broader trends and observations from doing quality reviews, they talk about at the engagement level conclusion and then overall trends. So what does that last bucket mean? There's an expectation now that as an internal auditor, a lot of times as you're doing these projects, you start to see maybe trends across individual audit projects that to the stakeholders may not be evident if they're only receiving the individual report. And so what might that look like? As you're doing a number of audits, you might see the same kind of common findings, whether it be ITG, access issues, or vendor management issues. And it's incumbent upon the CAE to kind of bring them individual audit findings across many reports, which in of themselves may not be a significant finding, but if you're starting to see that across many audits, would suggest that you maybe have a broader issue within the organization. There is then the focus on the actual engagement to have an engagement conclusion. And, you know, while it's not telling you need to have ratings, it's certainly telling you that you need to have a process in place in order for you to be able to articulate back to your stakeholders the overall significance of these findings within the report. So that may be the order in which the results are presented, which would be indicative kind of their priority, and then an overall conclusion. What I say with that is that internal audit functions need to step back and say, okay, what do I need to change within my standards, my methodology to support that overall process? So maybe we'll jump to the next slide. I think this next slide was really kind of meant to kind of quickly kind of summarize kind of what we've discussed. I think for the most part, I think we've covered the topics here. Maybe, Lorena, maybe as you're looking through the questions.
So if you're ready for me, I'll start throwing them at you.
Perfect. Okay. I'll try my best.
So the first one, it says, can you kindly explain the prerequisites for being an exceptional auditor? And this might be actually one we can do for the closing. I'm going to skip that one. Hold on. External QAR request you to please advise until which calendar year the internal audit team will be evaluated with the old 2017 standards.
I'm sorry, Lorena, could you repeat that question? Sorry again.
Can you advise as to until which calendar year will the internal audit team be evaluated with the old 2017 standards?
Yeah, so we're going to actually cover that in the next slide here too. We'll cover that question. That gives a little bit of the strategy and the timeline on the questions.
Will you be discussing or covering the scope of AI in auditing?
That's a very specific topic. And actually, as we look at our webinars, we're going to be talking about the whole hot topic of AI.
Okay, so we'll give you the next one then. What about IA standards that don't require internal audit reports to have ratings?
Yeah, I think maybe I just want to clarify that they're not saying, the IA is not saying that you have to have standards, or I should say ratings in place. I think what you just need to be able to have in place is a process that you can demonstrate how you communicate the importance or significance of findings within your overall results. So I think for most internal audit functions, in certainly some of the more kind of heavily regulated spaces, I've seen more of a focus around audit ratings. I will tell you, introducing audit ratings creates a whole different challenge within, report issuance and closing out reports, and can get very political. What I've tried to do over the years is try to steer away from that, but also at the same time, as in your role as a CAE or as an outsourced internal auditor, been able to convey to management and the board around what are the more significant findings. So hopefully that will address that requirement.
There is one more, there's a couple of more. So do you want me to keep giving you a few more? Or do you want to keep going?
Sure. You're going to keep us on track, Lorena, from a time. I think we're doing okay.
You're still good. You're still good now. We're back
Yeah.
up in where we need to be. Is there a standard? Which standard is CAAT covered, and is it a must requirement? Is that? In which standard is CAAT covered? And
that pertains to
Yeah.
computer assisted audit technologies, and I would think that probably falls under the technology initiative.
Okay.
Some of that, but I'd also say as well that kind of focus on data analytics is implied as well in kind of your overall audit process throughout. But you're right, Errol, specifically in that, and that would be the one around, are you doing, as a company, are you doing enough around data analytics, or how are you kind of risk assess or kind of cost benefit analyze the use of analytics in your organization?
I'm going to ask you one more and then you guys can keep going. What are some of the AI functions expected to have these standards? When are the IA functions expected to have these standards fully implemented?
Great question. And I apologize, I overlooked that. The standards were released in January of 2024, so only a couple of weeks ago. Internal audit functions have a year from that timeline to have addressed all the requirements of the changes in the standards. And that will go a little bit to the timeline and strategy of the quality assessment review that we'll talk in a few minutes. So the standards won't be effective, or internal audit functions won't be required to comply with it until that timeline. Obviously, that gives a good runway for internal audit functions to think through how they'll adopt and address the changes in the standards.
Perfect. And the last one, then I'll throw it back over to you, is have any of the QAIP requirements changed?
I haven't seen anything in the specifics around the QAIP that's different from prior, except the requirement that they must be reported annually. So the results of them must be reported annually. Again, back to my example from earlier, what I tended to find is the QAIP program for some organizations tend to be just simply limited to work papers. There's a lot more that internal audit does beyond kind of the individual audit engagements, and that could play into the overall quality and results of the function. So thinking beyond just simply taking a sample of work papers to conclude on the overall quality of the department. Obviously, there's elements within that then that will kind of give you a general indication as to if there's issues or quality issues elsewhere within the department, or the overall lacking in the methodology or process. So hopefully I answered the question from that lens. Maybe one thing I want to add, because I think we've largely covered the elements through our discussion, is the last item, which kind of falls a little bit outside just the recent release, but just to keep people keep it on the radar. They've also introduced the concept of what they call topical requirements. And the first one to be rolled out sometime this year will be around cyber. And so the expectation is that if you're doing a review in that specific topical area, that you're also following the guidelines and standards that have been prescribed within the topical requirements. I believe they're going through some consultation at the moment and won't be released till later in the year. But to keep that on your radar, and they'll be rolling them out over the next couple of years. And so that will kind of add to the kind of requirements that have been laid out in the standards. So Earl or Arlene, anything else to add on this slide? I know we talked a little bit about technology. Maybe Earl, just for a second, what do you think of the technology?
Yeah, just a couple of points on technology to highlight, Paul. It's going to be important to assess the feasibility of acquiring and implementing technology enhancements. Also important in developing and implementing plans to introduce the technologies, including a demonstration to both senior management and to the board as to the benefits of a particular technology. Audit executives should also be prepared to respond to questions regarding the risks that can come from new technology. So think about information security concerns, think about privacy concerns, personal data, ensuring that the audit executive is thinking about those and can clearly articulate those risks to board and senior management. And then lastly, and very importantly, there's a cost associated with the rollout of new technology enhancements. So chief audit executives will need to work closely with their executive sponsor and the audit committee to assess the feasibility for implementing new technology enhancements.
Yeah, no, thanks, Errol. And I think, as you say, it's striking that balance. As you kind of look at this quick summary slide here, I think, you know, again, I just want to stress we've only highlighted kind of from our lens some of the key changes that we kind of popped out through our review. I think all of these will have some level of, you know, changes needed in, you know, kind of your methodology or process. Some might be just enhanced documentation, but some may require more substantial changes. So I think it's kind of working through this, obviously depending on your maturity of your overall function, to think through kind of how you address that and kind of map out a timeline to address. So maybe we'll jump to the next slide. Yeah, so actually it might be helpful just to pop up. Arlene, maybe just give us a quick summary here, I think, on the kind of some of the considerations. I'd kind of describe this as more of your strategy around if you've got a QAR this year or certainly more next year, and kind of what you can think through.
Would you like me to reshare the poll status?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe. So go ahead, Arlene.
Yeah, so our poll here was just asking, when is the assessment due? So if you have an internal audit department and you had a QAR due to be performed in 2024, well, that review should be conducted against the current international practice framework. Now, as you prepare for your transition to the new standards, you may want to start looking at where there are additional things you need to do, basically doing a gap assessment against the new standards to identify those areas where you have to put enhancements or additional things in place to meet the new IAA standards. Now, if your review is due in 2025, you can accelerate that timeline into 2024, but you have to perform your readiness against the 2024 standards. So
Yeah,
that's kind of the timeline.
Yeah, thanks, Arlene. And I think obviously, you know, there's no getting out of, if you've got a review due this year, you got to get it done.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
So you have to get it done. And again, with the timeline, I think it's you know, I know the Institute of Internal Audit's working through developing their guidelines, their manuals to support the reviews that are done. But, you know, realizing that you want to kind of hold yourself accountable to what's the current standards and allowing you that timeline, doing that gap assessment, allowing you for it to better plan out and transition for the new standards is the way to think through it. Obviously, the focus on accelerating, you know, has some benefit. It keeps it a little more streamlined, but at the same time, it's, you know, I think it's better to kind of think through kind of doing the assessment up front and getting that readiness and getting things in place. Because I know this came up in a couple of client conversations. They were thinking about how do I tackle it, and the question was again, can I accelerate accelerate the review with the new standards? And that's going to be, again, I think that's going to be hard to do without the overall guidelines in place and the expectation that you have the standards in place across your key stakeholders. Let's maybe, I think we've got one more slide or a couple more slides, and then I think we can open up for additional Q&A, Lorraine, on this end. I think maybe, Earl, maybe some just quick highlights, just some insights around how we've kind of learned over the years doing the quality assessment reviews, what works, what doesn't, maybe some things to think about.
Yep. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, now that we've discussed the highlights of the QAR process, you know, how can we best optimize these reviews to maximize output and value, realizing that it's important to understand the level of flexibility, effort, and a focus with the reviews. And one key takeaway here to emphasize is engaging in working sessions to work through observations that come from the QAR. Take, for example, an observation from an assessment regarding the implementation of data analytics into an audit plan. There's a lot to put your arms around there, right? A lot to consider. Which audits would be best served in using data analytics, what technology and tools should be used to accomplish this, and then also evaluating the skill set for the IA department, as it's likely you'll have one individual who be the liaison overseeing that particular technology. So given the broad nature of the topic, we recommend engaging in working sessions with specialists to strategize how best to roll out a significant initiative area.
Yeah, I think on that latter comment, Earl, right? If you think about when you issue your audit reports, if you're in your day-to-day internal audit function, the idea of just lobbing it over the wall and you guys go fix it, it's like working, collectively to kind of think through what are the action plans, how do I best do that, how have others done it? Just the one comment I would add, what I found is, within the quality assessment reviews, there's obviously the baseline standards, but a lot of times when I talk to clients over the years, they're looking for additional areas, additional insights. I had one client, they just recently rolled out a methodology, a new internal audit methodology, and their comment to us was, how well are the teams adapting them methodologies, them new standards, and can we look maybe a little bit broader and deeper at more work papers than you would typically look at as part of the quality assessment review. Again, with the real focus on, they wanted to know what's there, what things could we look at, what things could we enhance, and maybe there's more enhancements or better things that we've seen elsewhere as it relates to a methodology. So some things to consider there in that respect. Maybe just kind of a quick, this is kind of a quick maybe call to action or kind of thoughts around, sorry, just on the next slide, Earl, just thinking through, so kind of maybe just in a quick wrap up before we jump into Q&A, what should, CAEs and internal audit directors be thinking through here over the next, year and kind of adopting the global standards? I'd say I would do a self-assessment and kind of doing that mapping exercise around, okay, maybe what historically do we have in place? Where do we think we're going to need to make changes? Where do we have gaps in our current program? Do we need to introduce more training, elements to address the overall standards and put a plan in place? Possibly you may want to think about doing kind of a quick mock assessment at some point as part of your QAIP or overall program later in the year to really kind of determine, are the steps been implemented? Are people executing against the new standards? I talked a little bit earlier about kind of that whole partnership as well with the board, senior management. What a great opportunity to open, a conversation with your key stakeholders around the standards have changed. Here's high level what we think they're going to be for us, and here's our action plan in place. And then lastly, I think what we talked a little bit around is, and that's why we kind of talked about the session initially was, obviously want to educate you a little bit on kind of thinking through, if you are subject to an external quality assessment review, what are kind of some of the strategy and thought process around when you do it and the timing from that perspective. I think obviously there was, probably I looked about, there was about maybe 40% of people have a review either this year or next year coming up. So a number of folks have a little bit more flexibility and a little more runway as they think through the global standards. So with that, I think maybe if we just jump to our, Q&A. I don't know if there's any additional questions.
Yes, there is.
Oh, okay.
So you have lots of questions. So
okay.
Hopefully they make sense the way I'm asking them for you. So here we go.
Sure, yeah.
First things first is, can you cover if there's going to be any sort of mapping from old standards to new standards to identify the required enhancements?
Yes, I believe so. And I guess that's some of the manual and guidelines that they're working through. As a firm, we're working through them process, that standard as well, their process as well, given that we've had to go through this very high level. But yeah, there will be, I believe at some point, a mapping that will be done. I suspect that will largely kind of give you the roadmap to kind of think through each of the standards, but will really only tell you how assuming that you're compliant with the standards from 17, how you get to the new standards. If you weren't compliant or hadn't been subject to a review under the 17 standards, then I think you need to step back and probably take a fresh look at the overall standards versus doing that gap assessment. Hopefully that makes sense.
Is there any audit standard that has been, oh wait, never mind, we talked about that one. Are there any standards that are well equipped to deal with the cybersecurity and cyber wellness areas?
Well, that touches a little bit on the topical requirements that I discussed earlier. around the topical requirements that will be rolled out at some point in 2024. I think there's a realization from the Institute of Internal Auditors that that's a particularly important area, a hot topic, has been for a number of years, and it's critical that, how you think about it from an internal audit function. So the topical requirements will certainly cover that. As you look at the standards currently, for the most part, the standards, and kind of as we walk through high level, are largely, I would say, agnostic across business and IT audits. So it's largely looking at the function or looking at the individual auditor and how we apply the standards.
You were going to discuss it, and maybe you already answered this, the external QAR, advising which calendar year the internal audit to evaluate it with.
I think we addressed that one again, and happy, I'd say we're going to get through some of the questions here. Happy to, talk through further with individuals as they think through it. There's pros and cons certainly to how you kind of accelerate it. The only thing I would emphasize is that the requirements, if you're due a quality assessment review in 2024, you got to get it done.
Right.
You can't push it back and say, well, I'm going to defer it because of the new standards.
Then we have, and I don't know if this is maybe more of an open question or an open topic of conversation, but it says kind of explain the prerequisites for being an exceptional auditor. I've met people who think becoming an auditor is a piece of cake. However, it's vice versa. Why are the auditors sometimes not respected in a good way? Or is it just because the language and the environment is ever changing? Again, I think this is more of like cake, I think, right?
Well, yeah, look, I think I'm great at what I do, and then my wife reminds me every day and brings me back down a level. Look, I think there's it's such a qualitative element to assess kind of skills and skill sets. I will tell you, as I step back and look at the overall, the goal and the focus in the standards around building that relationship with your key stakeholders, I think that will go a long way to enhancing the overall visibility and the overall respect for internal audit within the organizations. A lot of times I've seen internal audit organizations, over the years have been very insular. And what I mean by that, they largely kind of operate within their floor or their department and don't have much interaction with their key kind of stakeholders, with senior management. A lot of times senior management don't necessarily understand all of the things that internal audit does, the value that they bring, the insights they can bring, the subject matter. And really, I think about, as an internal auditor over the years, a lot of times I realize as I've worked in internal audit, people in the business side, elsewhere in the organization, don't have that same controls mindset. And that's a very strong competency that if you kind of educate your stakeholders around what you're doing, they quickly realize that you've got a very valuable skill set to bring to the table.
Mindset. That's a beautiful quote.
Yeah.
Another question for you is, from your prior quality assessment reviews, what are some of the most common findings, observations, and do you think they will be addressed throughout these new standards?
Yes, I'm sorry. I should pitch one or two of these to Earl or Arlene. I think I indicated a few times where I felt like the standards have been responsive to kind of some of the findings I found in prior things. I wouldn't necessarily, didn't fail the standard or the requirement, but they could have enhanced. They could have really demonstrated or gone above and beyond. Arlene or Earl, any thoughts on your end as you've gone through the standards where you think it kind of shores up or will help kind of bridge maybe some of that gap or maybe confusion in the standards from before?
So Paul, formalizing the communication between the internal audit function and the board and management, I think is, based on the handful of reviews that I've done, is going to be very beneficial. I think there's that inherent understanding, but it's not always, there isn't that proper level of cadence between the internal audit function and the executive team and or the audit committee. So formalizing that, it will be beneficial, and it has come up in past reviews as well. So I think there's a definite inherent benefit to that.
Yeah,
Okay.
and the other thing, that going back to what Errol spoke of before about skepticism, it wasn't explicitly stated before, but that's probably one of the areas where you said, well, why didn't you ask about that? Or, there was a different answer. So that's something that I think will be given more attention in the new standards. Not that it wasn't there, but it will be highlighted more and people will pay more attention to it.
Perfect. So that seems to be about most of the questions that you've already answered right now. I think that you've also been given a lot of suggestions and some great topics, because that was also coming in on the chats. And I know you mentioned you're planning on having additional webinars throughout the year.
Yeah, just to kind of close out, and again, thanks for everybody's time. There's been a lot of great questions. I can't see the chat on my end, but I can see the count, and I know there's been a lot. And so I really appreciate the engagement, people. I know this is a very relevant and timely topic. So I really appreciate everybody's time, attention today. We're certainly happy. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the specific topics. I know there's a lot to cover and a lot of different people with different levels of interest in the standards. And then, as you mentioned, Lorraine, as well, yeah. So we're rolling out a cadence this year for monthly webinars across different topics. All will be very relevant to the folks that are on the call today as it relates to internal audit, emerging risk topics. I know the topic of AI came up today, and certainly cyber. And we've got, within our team, the capabilities to kind of showcase some of the changes, some of the things that are more relevant to you as an internal auditor or within your specific organization.
Perfect. So I've put these in details on the chat. I've put all their contact information so that you can, of course, reach out to our team at DLA. That's all in the chat. We've also put the website address. Please make sure you go ahead and check them out. There's obviously a newsletter sign up if you want to stay in the know. You will also see a survey pop up at the end of today's webinar. So as soon as you close out, depending on which version of Zoom and or which browser you're using, you may see a survey pop up immediately after you exit the webinar. Please, we appreciate your feedback. It'll make us better for the next time. And it actually gives us an idea of what other topics you're looking to get a handle on. So please make sure you complete that out. If for some reason you don't see it, don't be alarmed. You're actually going to get a reminder in about a day or so with some more additional questions. So you'll get an opportunity to tell us what you want to learn more about. Again, all their contact information is on the chat. We appreciate you being a part of today. This will be available for download sometime next week. So we hope that you will, of course, rewatch, share with those that may be interested in this particular topic. Is there any other closing words that you'd like to say?
Lorena, thanks for all your help. Great coordination, and thanks to Earl and Arlene for a lot of work that went into it, and in a very short time window, obviously, with the standards been released. So we certainly appreciate everybody's time. Wish everybody all the best for the weekend, and thanks again.
No problem. Take care. You guys
Thank
can
you.
stay on.